Nurau Talks. Today we are very privileged to have Henry and Susan Mintzberg, who are actually from Montreal, so very local speakers today from our very own McGill University. And Henry is actually a writer, researcher, and educator. Saba, did you want me to restart? Oh, most of whose work focuses on managing organizations, developing managers, and rebalancing societies. So Henry has actually written 21 books that have earned him 21 honorary degrees, and he sits as the chair of management studies in the Desautels Faculty of Management at McGill University. So we're very privileged to have Henry, as well as Susan, who is his daughter. And it's a very cool collaboration. We'll talk a bit about that more in the talk. But Susan has spent the past 25 years researching and working in mental health care. She is currently completing a PhD at McGill School of Social Work. She studies the impact of collaboration and expertise in healthcare and focuses on family caregivers. So Susan is trained in family therapy and has many years of clinical practice in community mental health. It's a really cool mix of mental health and management, and we'll be talking more about that today. So maybe we can get started with talking about, Henry and Susan, how you guys started to work together and how did that really cool collaboration start?
You want to go?
You go ahead.
You go. Well, I'll start off by saying I never thought I would ever work or collaborate with my father. We were in very, very different fields, and I was always sort of relieved to not be in management. And then when I went to do a PhD and started thinking more academically, on my end, I realized that so many of our ideas, even though we were in different fields, really connected. And that's kind of how it started. We started sort of talking shop, I guess, a bit more. And then over time, took a few years, but over time, I'll pass it on to my father. But he sort of had an idea of something we could collaborate on. So,
well, our real collaboration really probably started in the canoe, because we went on a lot of canoe trips back then. But never did I imagine that I would be doing this with Susie. She had no interest in management, never looked at any of my books, even the first one that was dedicated to her, although she was 4 years old, I think, 4 or 5 years old when I published that. But somehow we started to realize, sort of scholarship is climbing a mountain from different sides. And we realized that as we were climbing from management and from social work, we were getting closer and closer. And mental health in organizations especially is obviously a connecting element.
Right. And it's really cool to see that kind of come together, which is exactly the intersection where Nurau sits. So it's cool to have both of your perspectives on this. So maybe a good question to ask next is, in thinking about managers, what do you think are the specific challenges that they face with regards to mental health?
Well, one thing I've written about, I mean, there are many dimensions to this, but one, we talk a lot about abuse, sexual abuse, and so on. We don't recognize, although many people personally recognize it as managerial abuse. A lot of managers have been referred to as kiss up and kick down. They know how to con people who are superior to them, or boards of directors, or more senior managers, or whatever, but really mistreat their managers. Now, I hear from so many people who are so miserable with bosses that are terrible. They can abuse them by forcing them to overwork. That's more commonly understood. But it's the abuse of talking down to them, ignoring them, pushing them, doing all kinds of awful things, not at all necessarily sexual. It's just aside from that. So
I also would say, because you're looking at kind of the challenges to mental health of managers, right? So,
yeah.
I think if we flip that around, why is some of this abuse of power happening? To a certain extent, if I look at it from a mental health perspective, I think there's this idea in management often that the people at the top kind of have the sense that they need to know it all and do it all. And that's not the reality. And it's part of the problem is that we're not kind of working with people on all levels properly. But that is a huge pressure and stress that people are living under, and unnecessarily, right? Because I mean, not only unnecessarily, but to the detriment of management, because it shouldn't be, top-down management. It shouldn't be people at the top thinking they need to do it all, because then you're not working collaboratively with kind of full teams. So I think if that culture changed, I would imagine that would also impact in a positive way the mental health of managers.
Yeah, I remember early on a story Susie used to tell me before she ever thought this was her introduction to management, when she worked in a bookstore and she was not in the management position at all. And she's sitting at her desk doing her thing. And these guys would appear from, usually guys, they would appear from head office and look down at Susie, quite literally, and ask the store manager all kinds of questions. And Susie was sitting there and she said, "Why don't they just ask me? I'm the one who's doing it. I can answer."
Yeah. I think that was my introduction to this this was before I was even in social work. But this idea that, the top people are only talking to the top people and not those on the ground. And I think that puts it puts a lot of pressure on people who believe in this, who believe they need to have all the answers, who believe that they're the only experts, in a team. So.
Right. And I think we talk a lot about loneliness too, and how that can affect mental health. And I think managers, that can really contribute to a feeling of loneliness amongst managers. I think we have a question in the chat from Justin. Are we talking about horizontal management practices? Is there a sort of move in management towards, instead of a top-down approach, having more of a horizontal approach?
I'll give a quick answer and then I'll let the management person take it over. I would not call it horizontal. I would call it collaborative management practices.
Okay.
Maybe it is horizontal, but
yeah, I'm not sure what's meant by horizontal, but horizontal would be just relationships between peers, or at least treating people like peers. Managers should be peers, especially where a manager maybe have some kind of contact with somebody in somebody else's department. Hierarchy doesn't matter, even though that person may be at a lower level in the chart. But these charts are kind of silly. The organization chart doesn't tell you anything except who reports to who. You can't even tell what the place does for a living by looking at an organization chart. All you know is who reports to who. So lateral, I would use the word lateral rather than horizontal.
I see.
But, yeah.
Great. So, we talked about mental health of managers. Let's switch a bit to mental health of employees. Dr. Mintzberg, or Henry, I know that you have a theory about 3 different kinds of managerial roles and the different styles of leadership. Can we talk a bit about how you think different styles of management or leadership can affect the mental health of employees differently?
Yeah, well, the roles that I talk about these days, I see them on 3 planes: a kind of information plane, a people plane, and an action plane. So on the information plane, managers spend a lot of time just collecting and sharing information. They go all over the place. They create contacts both inside their organizations and within their own units and across their organizations and outside to government departments and customers and all that kind of thing. So a lot of managing is informational, and I guess from a mental health point of view, the important thing is to keep the people around you informed enough so they can do their work comfortably. The second plane is the people plane. That gets a lot of attention, which is, developing teams and motivating or encouraging employees and so on and so forth. Building culture, and also externally creating links to people outside is also on the people plane. And again, good managers put people at ease. If somebody's working for you and you call them in to see you, the first thing they might think is, "Oh my God, is he going to cut my salary, or is he going to fire me, or whatever?" You can put people at ease by saying, "I'd really like to chat, just to catch up. You're doing a great job." And then the action plane is doing. Sometimes managers do what their organizations do. They meet customers, they produce product. Steve Jobs at Apple spent his mornings in research lab developing product. You're not supposed to do that as a chief executive of a big company. But of course, it was his genius that made it a big company. You know, the people who worked with him, he was known to be very rough with people, but yet if you worked with him every morning, you got a sense that, you know, if you made your case, he listens and he changes his mind. So it's all about kind of transparency, openness, honesty.
I would just add, I think it's like also about the culture of, it's openness, but it's also giving space to the voices of people at all levels. So one of the things that we see, and we saw this throughout the pandemic, you know, a lot of decisions were being made very top down during the pandemic. And we're not often listening to the voices of employees on the ground. And I think when people are working in any field and they feel that they're not heard, and they feel that they're, you know, what they're good at or what they're experts at is sort of being brushed aside, that has huge impact on mental health. So if you're going to work and feeling like, you know, what's the point of being here? Because anything I say is either, you know, people listen about lip service or, you know, they're not listening at all. That has huge impact. And I mean, one just quick example that really struck me, and I'd written an op-ed about this during the pandemic, was when they were making decisions about the school system. There was all kinds of decisions during the pandemic. And at one point, the premier of Quebec had made a comment that he wanted to speak to the experts, but it wasn't the teachers. And I had written a piece on teachers are experts too. So, I mean, we saw during the pandemic how much teachers and nurses and, you know, people were suffering because they just weren't being heard. They weren't part of the decision making. And I think it comes down to just, you know, creating a culture where we want to listen and hear what people have to say at all levels.
Yeah, that's good, Susie. Yeah, we have a question from the chat. Sasha asked, how can managers ensure that their employees are high performing, having good psychological health while still being in a remote work situation, especially with the pandemic, you know, and how that has shifted a lot of work remotely? How do you think managers can still care for their team's mental health?
Yeah, it's tough, you know, if you're if you because it's really personal relationships. Although there's nothing you can get quite personally involved with on a Zoom call. You're seeing each other face to face. In fact, the interesting thing that's going on right here, as an example, is you've got 3 images of 3 people who are chatting with each other, and yet there could be hundreds or thousands of other people who are not seeing us remote, far away on a stage, not remotely, but far away on a stage. They're seeing us, you know, a few inches away from the screen. So you know, you can make up for that, but teamwork and so on really needs people to get together. Same thing with creative problem solving. You really need people to get together, kick things around, walk around the room, scribble things on the whiteboard.
But I think, again, coming back to this idea of, you know, the culture, and that comes from leadership. It's a culture of connection. People like people. Like some people don't, but most people like to connect to people. And I think when you're talking about psychological health or mental health, if there's an environment where you feel there's room for connection, but like true connection, so you don't have to be best friends, but where you feel kind of, you know, I think what Henry said earlier about, you know, inviting someone into your office and really wanting to hear what they have to say. And if employees know that, and they feel they're in an environment where people actually want to hear them, they're going to be much more open to talking about, you know, psychological issues that might be going on without being afraid that, you know, there's going to be stigma, I'm going to be fired. So I really think it's about that culture and that sort of a culture of connection. I think connection is what it all comes down to, honestly.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I know, Susan, you did a lot of work during the pandemic about, you know, loneliness and of seniors and long-term care homes, things like that. And so I'm curious to know your perspective on, like the loneliness that happened during the pandemic, especially in the workplace. Was there anything that came up or that you thought of or thinking about during this time?
Yeah, I think the sort of the shift to, you know, work from home or telework, whatever, I think had positive and negative. I think the negative for sure is the isolation, and, you know, like Henry said, like you don't have that opportunity just to connect over coffee or at the water fountain or whatever. So that was gone. I think that's hugely problematic for isolation. But I think the flip side of it is we kind of learned that it sort of highlighted the expertise of people in a way, right? We always imagine that, you know, working from home is never going to work. People aren't going to work hard enough. And the pandemic showed it's the opposite. So, you know, I think partly it highlighted that what people are capable of, which then affects mental health in a positive way, that you feel kind of that you're validated. But the other thing is also that I just lost my other thing. I had another point to make and it went out of my head. So I'll pass the baton.
No worries.
I had a thought, but it's, yeah.
I'll come back.
leave the baton. I'll leave
The baton is yours.
I'll leave the baton because it's more your subject this time. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, maybe it'll come back to me. But hold on, I had a note. Hold on. No, anyhow.
Maybe in the meantime, I'll ask Henry. Henry, what do you think we've learned about management through the pandemic?
That's a good question that nobody's ever asked me. I think maybe ironically, it's maybe not what we learned, but what I hope we learned, which is the importance of being together, the importance of being face to face, the importance of going in the office. It doesn't mean you can't switch from 5 days a week to say 2 days a week in the office, as long as people get there at the same time so they can interact. But I think it also shows the limitations in a way. I do a blog called mintzberg.org/blog, and I did one with a doctoral student of mine about about how centralizing and maybe more controlling a Zoom call is, because it's a little less spontaneous. Somebody has a mute button that they can play with. If a manager is meeting with his or her team, they can control who speaks when. They may let people come in, but it's a little more awkward than interfering or piping in during an informal meeting together.
Right. So it almost seems as there's more formality, and that kind of impacts the way that managers have to adapt. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
If I can go back, I can pick up on that. But the other thing, it came back to me, is that the pace changed. I think when we kind of moved things home, there was just a different pace of work. And yet from, what I've heard, and I think what the research is showing is work was still getting done. So it sort of showed us that we can do work that is just as good, and managers can still be doing their jobs, but at a much healthier pace. Now, I don't necessarily say we should always work from home, because I do think that need to be together is important, and kind of like that point about being on Zoom. And but I do think it shows us that we don't need to be, pushing and working at the rate or at the pace we were pre-pandemic. So even if we come back to, offices, can we sort of somehow bring it down a level? And I think that applies especially to leadership and managers, because that's who's setting the culture of a organization or of a team. And if there's this kind of like, we got to go all the time, that has huge impact on mental health.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think one shift is that managers were allowing workers to have more autonomy and more flexibility in their schedules. So perhaps that's a good thing that came out of the pandemic, that managers now are shifting towards like, okay, maybe, people can have more control over when they pick up their kid, or, things like that. So, yeah.
And less micromanaging, right? I think, again, it comes back to respecting the expertise of employees. Like, at one point I made a comment, because I'm not from management, but I was sort of a bit careful, but I sort of thought, managers aren't the experts. Managers manage the expertise. So, they have an expertise for sure, but a manager's job is to be managing the expertise of their employees. Mm-hmm. And we need to, if we don't respect that our employees each bring something, whatever your job is, and I think by working at home, where there wasn't always, the manager right there kind of micromanaging everything, it allowed people's expertise, I think, maybe to shine a little bit more, I think.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
Just quickly, in companies, sometimes you have to check in and check out, and time in and time out when you're leaving, when you're coming and all that. I haven't heard of anybody who's suggested they put a video camera in your home to check if you're working. It's conceivable, but obviously nobody except Putin would do something like that. But that's the difference, that you do become more empowered, whether you use it to do work more effectively or to goof off,
Right. So that inherently demands more trust, I think, from managers, because now they can't, be peering over their employee's shoulder. We do have another question from the chat. Considering that most employees want to stay in this work from home setup, what does this mean for management? What kind of change do you think this would mean, for a manager now that their employees do want to stay in this kind of work from home arrangement?
Well, I guess they've got to be more careful about to make sure everything's going well and to make sure people are in touch. It's harder. You can be in the office called management by walking around. You just drop in on people's offices and walk into meetings, and you can do all that informally. You obviously have to make more effort, concerted effort, to do it when people are working at home.
Yeah, the checking in and building connection, for sure. Another question, how do you not micromanage, but still stay responsible for your employees' mistakes?
Yeah, I mean, you walk a fine line. Look, in my book, Simply Managing, I talk about conundrums of managing. Conundrums are things you can't resolve, but you have to be aware of. And you could call this a conundrum. There's no way out. You don't want to be accused of micromanaging on one hand, but sometimes you got to get in deeper and closer. And risk. The head of a famous supermarket chain in Montreal used to spend his Saturday mornings shopping in his stores. Okay, not shopping, but walking around his own stores. Now, was he micromanaging in the sense he was checking them out, making sure the shelves were filled, making sure the people were happy, or was he just keeping himself informed? It's not micromanaging to keep yourself informed, to know what's going on.
I would also kind of be curious, I don't know if this has been looked at or studied, but if you take the manager kind of and remove them a bit so they're not micromanaged, so employees don't feel that there's always someone looking over their shoulder, someone's going to, pick up on their mistakes. I sort of wonder if that gets people to, put more into their work. Like if you always assume that there's someone else above who's at the end of the day going to be making the decisions, or at the end of the day is going to tell you whether you did it right or wrong, then you kind of just become like, almost like part of an assembly line. Whereas if you sort of feel that you're a bit more independent and the person above you is trusting you, I just wonder if, I'm sure this has been studied, but where you would end up making fewer mistakes because you need to sort of take more responsibility for those mistakes. It's very easy to slack off if you think someone else is going to, as a parent, you take it outside of management, right? Like look at life. If you think someone else is going to pick up the pieces for you, you're not going to be as attentive to what you're doing, I think.
I think it's an excellent point. Of course, parents are managers in a way too. But here you've got an interesting thing because you've got co-management, which is a taboo in many companies. I once recommended in a hospital where the head of the hospital was not a physician and was great at negotiating with government outside, but was almost intimidated by the physicians inside. And I said, it really needs co-management. And all the business members of the board of that hospital were up in arms like, co-management? No, you can't have that. Somebody's got to be in charge. Well, families shouldn't work then.
Yeah, well, maybe that's a good kind of segue to our next question, because we have Isabel asking, Dr. Mintzberg, you've been in this field for many years now. How do you see management evolving in the future, in the next 10 to 20 years?
Well, there was a well-known person in Denmark who said, I never predict, especially the future. And the problem is that optimists predict what they like and pessimists predict what they don't like. So let me pick on something I don't like. I think the biggest change in management over the course since I've been studying it is it's become more disconnected. And we've hyped up leadership as if it's separate from management. Well, leaders who don't manage don't know what's going on. We can't separate leadership from management. But we've disconnected, so people think that management is about reading financial statements or like reading a case as they do in a Harvard MBA program, looking on their management as a case. Give me 10, 50 pages and I'll give you a decision. That's been a very negative thing. I'm always a fan of managers who get on the ground, know what's going on, see what's going on, not to micromanage, but just to be aware and to inform themselves of what's going on.
Right. So I think kind of moving away from a traditional style of maybe purely informational, going back to your 3 planes, Henry, and I think the people plane actually is becoming super important nowadays, as we keep talking about connection and how to create a culture where people feel safe and like they belong and all that. So I think, if I may offer my 2 cents, I think that plane is really going to be something that has to be developed and evolving in the next few years.
And I think people are tired of not being heard, right? I mean, we see that over the last several years where, protests or people walking out or, we're seeing it with nurses right now, I think in Ontario, like it's, people want to do jobs where they feel respected, where they feel that they're respected for what they know, for what they're good at. And, I'm not in the field of management, but I certainly hope that, over the next, maybe not 10, 20, but, over time, that we can move further and further away from this idea that the experts are at the top and really sort of move more to a collaborative approach in management.
Back to the bookstore.
Maybe. I'll finish my PhD and then go back to selling books. Sounds
good. Then you go back to managing bookstores the way they should be managed.
Good. Well, speaking about books, if you ever want to stay up to date with what Henry's doing, he has so many books out there. Are you in the middle of writing another one, Henry, or are you done with book writing?
Yeah, I'm always in the middle of writing another one, but the latest one is called Understanding Organizations, and that just came out. But what I'm really spending my time on is what I call rebalancing society, and people can see rebalancingsociety.org. Especially because the world is out of whack, very, very seriously out of whack. And so somebody's got to deal with it, right? So
maybe could you give us just I know we're really over time, but I really would love to have a 1-minute pitch maybe about what Rebalancing Society is and what that book is about.
1 minute or less, go.
So a balanced society balances public sector government that's respected with private sector business that's responsible and what I call plural sector communities that are robust, okay? And communism took it out of balance in favor of government, and populism takes it out of balance in favor of particular community groups like religion in Iran, and capitalism takes it out of balance in favor of private sector forces and private sector individualistic interests. And most of the world is out of balance one way or another, mostly in favor of private sector forces. And it's destroying us. It's stopping effort to change, to stop income disparities, to stop climate change, and so on. So we need to deal with that. And we need to deal with it on the ground. It's not going to come from leaders, and it's not going to come from the top. It's going to come from movements on the ground, like the Reformation of Martin Luther in the 16th century. It's going to come from the ground.
Wow, very cool.
Can I come back to your first question for a minute? Because I just had a flash as I heard you talking. Your first question was what kind of brought us together. And I just remembered when you first published this as a pamphlet, it wasn't a book yet, Rebalancing Society. I was going to the launch or whatever, and I had to read through it. So I don't usually read my father's stuff. But I read this. Yeah, it was before it was a book, though. And I read it, and I went, holy moly, this is like applies to social work. Like this book should be used in social work. Yeah, it was that.
Cool.
And that was my first kind of, I think, aha moment where I went, hold on a minute, like does our work connect more than I ever realized? So yeah, I just completely forgot that and had a flash as I was listening to you talk. So I think this Rebalancing Society, I mean, I think you're coming at it, from a expert in management, but I mean, this applies to all fields because it completely applies to social work. And so it's, just bring in other fields, it applies all over the place. So.
Right. Well, very cool. Thank you so much, Henry and Susan, for sharing all your thoughts with us. I know we could go on for a long time, and we did go 15 minutes over, but everyone was very engaged, and thank you everyone for your
Who's the audience typically?
Yeah, so we have managers. I mean, we have HR. We have, I know in the chat we have some people who work for HBR, Harvard Business Review, who have come on. They write case studies. So yeah, a big variety of people who are generally interested in knowing where the field of management and mental health is going.
Really terrific. I enjoyed that. Very good. Very well done.
Yeah, so I think, to summarize, you guys really talked about connection and belonging. That's one thing I really heard from your sharing today, and having managers know how to develop people skills, which I think if you're a manager listening here, that's something that we should be thinking about. And especially the shift to remote work, I think, is something that managers are also struggling to adapt to. And so, yeah, stay up to date with that's something that we at Nurau are trying to do, equip managers better to deal with this current age. And I'm sure Henry and Susan, you guys both are also, thinking about that, and everyone here can kind of keep on up to date with what you guys are doing, and yeah, it's really great work. So thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Great work on your end too.
Yeah, terrific. Very good.